I'm so excited to introduce the last event of the evening. And it's really my honor to introduce our first keynote speaker for this workshop, author and small business owner Leah Johnson, who made a Herculean effort to get here through the snow. So we're really happy about that. Let me just say a little bit about Leah before she comes up. Leah grew up right here in Indiana on the west side of Indianapolis. She earned her BA at Indiana University and her MFA at Sarah Lawrence College. Her debut young adult novel, You Should See Me in a Crown, was published in 2020 and earned her a Stonewall Book Award honor. In 2021, Time named this book one of the 100 best young adult books of all time. Her second novel, Rise to the Sun, was released in 2021, and her middle grade debut, Ellie Engel Saves Herself, was recently published by Disney Hyperion. I think Leah brings a really interesting perspective to our discussion about freedom of expression. Her first book, You Should See Me in a Crown, not only earned the accolades that I just mentioned, it was also one of the over 50 books classified as obscene and placed under investigation by the Oklahoma Attorney General's office. In part, based on that experience, Leah has recently opened Loudmouth Books, an Indianapolis independent bookstore dedicated to highlighting banned books and uplifting the work of marginalized authors. So if you're in Indianapolis, you should check that out. So please now join me in welcoming Leah Johnson.
Come on, keep it going, keep it going. Okay, so I went through hell to get here. So I'm going to try and make this worth our while, okay? Okay? Yeah. We're going to do this together. Thank you so much. What's your name? Jack, keep that going. Keep that energy going. Okay, so like the introduction said, my name's Leah Johnson. I write books for a living, but I also own a bookstore, and I'm also a professor at Butler University. And so, are there any Butler students here? Great. Not here, but we love that in spirit. Love that. Okay, are there any IU students here? Wow, all of my institutions are just really not repping today. Okay, I'll throw out another one. I don't know, Ball State. No? What is going on in here? Okay, where are y'all from? Okay, great. UND, yeah. Okay, so my brother went to UND, so I'm like really homegrown, truly. Me, my brother, my sisters, all of us were raised here, grew up here, educated here. I'm the only one who still lives here, though, so I wonder why that is. I'm sure it has something to do with the lack of freedom of expression, which is what we're here to talk about. So we got a lot of ground to cover, and I write books for children, and so I'm used to having audiences with short attention spans. So we're going to try and cover that ground really, really quickly, okay? If you don't see me looking at you, it's because I'm reading off of my iPad. I'm not even going to pretend like I'm doing this off the top of the dome. Back in the day when I first started doing speaking gigs, I used to like memorize hours of text so that I could really feel like, oh, she's fresh, she's on it, she's in it. But I literally just drove through a backwoods frozen tundra for an hour and a half to get here. So I'm not even gonna pretend like I'm sharp today, okay? She's crusty and dusty, and that's all right. So my first book was called You Should See Me in a Crown, and it is a romantic comedy about a girl named Liz Leidy whose only dream is to get out of her small and small-minded Midwestern hometown and go to college. But those plans are derailed when she loses her scholarship and has to run for prom queen because there's a scholarship for prom queen instead. And that would be tough enough for a wallflower, an anxious, neurodivergent wallflower like Liz Leidy. I wonder who she's based off of. But it's made even more difficult when she begins to fall in love with her competition for queen. And this is a rom-com, a lot like the rom-coms I was obsessed with in my early teen years. Cinderella Story with Hilary Duff. I know some of you all know. Okay, yeah, Princess Diaries, anybody? Anne Hathaway, my queen, my white queen. You slap a crown on a white girl, let me tell you something. You slap a crown on a white girl, and I was in when I was a teenager. I was like, that is high art. And I wanted to write into that space, but I also wanted to write a story that reflected my lived experience as a queer Black girl growing up in rural adjacent Indiana. So if any of you are from Indianapolis, then you know that if you get far enough west, you get to a point where you're technically still in Indianapolis, but you are in the middle of a cornfield. Doesn't matter where you go, you're surrounded by a cornfield. And so when I tell people, nah, I'm from a small town, they're like, no, you're from a big city. No, girl, I'm not, okay? It was very, very different when I was growing up. And the stories that I identified with the most often erased identities and experiences like mine. And so in You Should See Me in a Crown, the book opens with a quote by James Baldwin. And the quote is, "The place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it." There was something so quietly radical to me about that line the first time I read it. A gay Black man born in 1924, that's before the Civil Rights Movement, that's before the gay rights movement, any of that. This is a man who wrote himself into existence on the page, knowing full well that creating that presence in the work was likely the only way he would ever get to see it. He wrote joyous, complex, really sad sometimes, gay characters and stories about Black life that scarcely existed in a way that would have before Baldwin got there. Somebody said one time, and this stuck with me ever since, that to write stories that you haven't seen before, especially as a Black person, especially as a queer person, is to build the plane as you're flying it. So the spaces that we are creating are brand new, are innovative, inventive, but are also terrifying in some cases. And so I read this quote for the first time when I was an undergrad. And at the time, I was a journalism and African diaspora studies major at IU, which I was hoping there would be somebody from IU here so they would be like, yeah. But we'll just have to make do. Wait, thank you so much. Is anybody here from Purdue? Okay, great, perfect. In that case, I think that's fine. I think it's totally fine that nobody from IU is here. So up until that point in my life, I'd never read James Baldwin, and I'd never read any Black queer writers who grew up understanding that they were queer. And that's an important distinction to make. As familiar as I was growing up with the work of Alice Walker or Lorraine Hansberry or Langston Hughes, I was missing a crucial detail in their work, and that's that it was informed not only by Blackness, but by their queerness. But when I was at IU, it's a PWI, it has a 4% Black population. There's about 40,000 students that are in the IU system. And so somebody who's better at math than me can tell you that that's like 1 in every 400 students or something that are Black. And so I was swallowed up in this sea of whiteness. And because I was in this space where there weren't a lot of people who looked like me, I had to actively seek out people who were part of my community. I started to think about stories in a way that was a lot different than the way I'd thought about them before. It wasn't just about entertainment. It wasn't just about doing something because I was good at it. And I was always good at writing. I was like, I'm bad at math. I'm never going to be a scientist. I'm not going to be an astronaut. I'm probably not even going to be a lawyer because I have ADHD and I can't study for the bar. But you know what I can do? I can make shit up. And so I knew that I wanted to be a writer, right? But I didn't know that it was possible to tell the kind of stories that I wanted to tell. And so I was feeling really isolated. I was feeling really lonely in my experience at IU. And then it wasn't until I started writing through my experience that I was able to sort of start affirming myself and my identities. And then I had the bright idea of moving to New York and becoming a writer. And so I went to New York and I got my MFA in writing from Sarah Lawrence College, which is a really small school, but it's also really, really liberal and super, super expensive. And so I was surrounded by people who not only could pay for the tuition of Sarah Lawrence, which was at the time the most expensive tuition in the country, but also people who were used to having their worldviews affirmed for them constantly. And so I felt, even when I was in the island of misfit toys at Sarah Lawrence, surrounded by a bunch of other weird queer people like me, I still felt very outside of myself. And so in my first year, in my first semester, I was one of the only Black people in my cohort, and I started working on what would become You Should See Me in a Crown. And I was taking a writing workshop, and I don't know if any of you are writers, but if you've ever been in a writing workshop, then you know that people are so stupid. unbearably stupid. And you're not allowed to tell them that they're stupid because you're supposed to be constructive, right? And so I was in this workshop, and I remember feeling really out of my depth in the room because I was new, I was young, and I was also different from everybody else in my cohort. And in my first workshop, the question of race comes up. And nobody in the room is equipped to deal with it. And frankly, I didn't want to deal with it because the job of talking about race and racism should not fall on the people who are affected by it. It should fall on the people who are in positions of privilege. But I didn't know that at the time, but I had the language to talk about that. So in that first week, a white classmate of mine said something about how they didn't feel the need to discuss race in their work. It just wasn't necessary, she said. And I didn't speak then because I didn't have the language yet to articulate why that was a ridiculous position to take, but I did wrestle with it when I walked out of the classroom. As someone whose work is for Black women and about Black womanhood, I couldn't understand how someone thought that delineating between races wasn't an important part of any narrative. Past important, it was crucial. It was central to the work that I was doing, trying to affirm a place in the world, not just for myself, but for my characters and also for my readers. Another time in that same workshop, it was a hell of a workshop, okay? A white male classmate wrote about a school shooter from the perspective of the white male school shooter in a way that asked the reader to empathize with the shooter, right? And this was in 2015, 2016. And so it was we were not quite as far ahead as we are now in terms of talking about mass violence in this country. But even at the time, I still knew that I felt really uncomfortable with what I was hearing. And I thought it was really irresponsible to take a perspective like that, especially in the current political moment we were in. Because writing does not just exist on the page, it also exists in the world, right? And I voiced that opinion in the workshop, and I was met with this take by my professor. Leah, not everything needs to be political. And I said, okay, all right, I'll shut the fuck up. I didn't say anything else for the rest of that semester. I did write an essay about her in the Huffington Post, though, and she did not like that very much. But you didn't want me talking class, so I'm going to take it to the internet. So no one in my class at the time challenged that idea, and neither did I. Instead, I sat there, slightly deflated, and waited for the clock to run out. And I could do this all day, by the way. I could give you 100 different scenarios of times where I felt alienated in a classroom. I felt like people were taking a position that was antithetical to what I believed in, and I didn't have the language to explain why. And anybody who's ever sat in a classroom where they weren't in the dominant position, if they weren't in the majority, has probably felt that same way. But my point is this: how can you learn from and alongside people who can't understand why your life and your body are always going to be politicized? If you can't understand that, which is the most basic tenet of my writing, how could you possibly provide feedback for me? Feedback that's more insightful than just like comma placement and sentence structure. So the place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it stuck with me. And I was young because I was away from home for the first time, because I was learning how to take ownership of all of my identities, and I was radicalized in a way by this writing. I had a period of my life where I started to conceptualize the magnitude of all the systems working to quite literally kill the people that I loved. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about ways to dismantle those systems and what it would look like to build something in their place that was more ethical, more equitable, more just than what we have currently. And that's when I published You Should See Me in a Crown. I was writing back to the girl I was when I first discovered that quote, while also trying to pay homage to the Black queer writers that opened the door for me to do that work. So Lorraine Hansberry, who I mentioned earlier, has this quote where she says, I'm a writer, and I suppose I think the highest gift that man has is art, and I am audacious enough to think of myself as an artist, that there is both joy and beauty and illumination and communion between people to be achieved through the dissection of personality. And when we look at these texts, not just my book, but any of the books that have moved me over the course of my life, which are as clearly audacious as they are radical, which I do dare to say about my own work because I am that girl. especially as we think about them within the time that they're first created, we should also be thinking about the joy that is to be found within the simple act of applying the windows and mirrors theory. What is it that these windows, that these stories can tell us about ourselves? That's the mirror. And what is it they can tell us about each other? That's the window. How can the language we use bring us closer, not only to each other, but to ourselves? For me, that looked like, first and foremost, finding my people. I carved out a community for myself within my program, largely populated by Black, queer, and brown folks, POC, who were able to do the work that I was able to do the work. We were able to do the same work for each other. You see what I'm saying? We were able to critique each other in a way that was culturally competent. But this is something that applies to everybody. Anytime you are in a space where you are trying to shake shit up, you're trying to make a difference, you're trying to take a stand, you're trying to find your voice, the first step to that is finding your community. It is finding the people who can stand beside you, who can link arms with you and walk into battle with you. It's finding the people who know how to take up arms and advocate on your behalf when you don't have the capacity to do it. And it is when you are in a position of privilege or a position of power, it is finding those people and not taking the microphone from them, but handing it over to amplify their voice. And so those are all things at the heart of the novel I wrote, I think. And all of them return, of course, back to the epigraph. That Black folks, queer folks, Black queer folks are constantly building tables of our own and rebuilding them once white people attempt to co-opt them, which happens frequently, because we've never been offered seats at the dominant table. Rebirth and reinvention are in our nature. So in these small ways, we made a program when I was in grad school. We made a program within a program. Like, yeah, we had classes with everybody, but we were also doing classes with just each other. And sometimes that's what you have to do. You're doing it here this weekend. You have found an additional community to build with, to find community with, to organize with, right? That's the basis of what it takes to make any sort of change. None of it is done alone. And something that I did not know when I was 18, 19, when I was isolated and I was struggling with my queerness and I didn't have the language to articulate how to be of service not only to myself, but to the world. The thing that I didn't know is that that hopelessness, that loneliness, that exhaustion, those are all tools of the oppressor. You feeling like you don't have power, you feeling like you don't have the energy to carry on, you feeling hopeless and joyless, those are all tools that are used to keep you from doing the work. And so find your people, find folks who will energize you and will keep you going, because that is going to be at the core of all the work you're going to be able to do. And so as I was finding my people, we were advising each other, we were writing political work, we were writing what was radical to us, we were being subversive, but we always couched it in joy and honesty. And so one of the things I'm returning to constantly in this talk, but also just like in my work, is this idea that joy is an inherently radical act. And I say that because fascism depends on joylessness, it depends on hopelessness, it depends on all of us deciding that it's not worth it to continue fighting. But also because joy has been stolen from so many of us for so many years, that the work we do is an attempt at reclamation, is an attempt at finding that joy and renaming it. And so all of those things come with their own sorts of resistance and has a set of conflicts attached to it. So when I started working on my first novel, I was thinking about what it means to have a really American institution that has historically excluded people like me, the institution of prom, which something at its core is like very, very heteronormative, right? It's like not designed for queer folks. There are a lot of high schools in the United States, even now, where you can't go to prom with somebody of the same sex, or you have to dress as the gender you were assigned at birth. And so taking an institution and sort of flipping it on its head was really central to the work that I decided to do. I wanted to write through this duality of being multiple things at once, but never feeling totally whole in any of those identities. It's a duality that is awkward and uncomfortable and painful at times. And it should not be radical that a Black queer girl from Indiana can be a prom queen, but like, watch Fox News every once in a while, you peep that it is a little bit radical still. So if Liz, my main character, was gonna pave the way, I wanted her to do it in a way that felt honest, but also like just extremely, extremely gay. And so that's what I'm interested in doing in all my work now, and that I seem to be making a career out of doing. I'm imagining possible futures. And I'm creating and crafting worlds now that don't deny Black women, Black girls, joy. And I'm giving us space on the page in which we can love and be loved, and that love is not earned through trauma. Liz, the main character, is not out here trying to win a Nobel Prize for race relations and gay rights. She just wants to be Black and visibly queer in public without fear of being on the receiving end of some sort of violence. And Black women so often are held to unreasonable expectations of strength and stoicism and sexlessness. And so in this book, I wanted to relieve Liz of all that, and by extension, relieve myself of all those things. Writing towards that was my liberatory practice. But to write about identity, to do work that centers who you are and your values and your politics, is also political. So for those of you who are not familiar with this idea of intersectionality is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a genius. She is my mother. She doesn't know that. She raised me. But intersectionality are all the ways in which your identities intersect. It's to say that none of us are any one thing, that my Blackness is informed by the fact that I'm a woman, my womanhood is informed by the fact that I am queer, and all those things sort of exist together, right? And so because my work and who I am exist hand in hand, it's why when those things come under attack, it is not just an attack on my personhood, but also an attack on my livelihood. And so last year, when book bans were at an all-time high, in 2021 and the first half of 2022, nearly half of all the banned books PEN America was able to track were about queer characters, right? And so in this moment, when there were so many books being banned, so many books being challenged, my own books among them, with the language of indecency and obscenity, explaining why they deserve to be banned, I decided to open a bookstore that highlighted and uplifted banned and challenged books. And that all came together because I wanted still, outside of my writing, to reclaim some sense of power. And so one of the things that I want us to be thinking about always is how is the work that we're doing an attempt at reclaiming power, not just for ourselves, but for the people who got us here, for the communities that rally around us and encourage us. And if you are a part of if you are a part of populations that are historically more empowered, how can you take that power and reallocate it? So I teach a class at Butler called One Direction Will Save the World. And it's about the politics of fandom. It's a really cool class. I won't be teaching it next year, though, because it's so much work writing lectures every week. My God. But it's about the politics of fandom and about how fan culture can be an organizing principle for how we see ourselves and also how we approach politics. It's a cultural criticism class at its core, but it's also intended to generate discussions about who we are and how we move through the world. And one of the lectures that I taught last semester was about the 4 eyes of oppression. I don't know if y'all have got to that in this workshop. You'll get there eventually if you stay in organizing long enough. But the 4 eyes of oppression are internalized, ideological, etc. The one that I want to talk about is ideological oppression. And it's the first thing that any dominant group has to do to establish a sense of power, is to change the narrative, is to somehow control language. So if you can drive an ideology, if you can change the way that people talk about each other and think about each other, then you can control just about anything. And so it starts with telling people over and over again who is valuable and who is not, who deserves life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and who doesn't. And that ideology bleeds into the institutions that govern us. like education, like policy, like healthcare, everything from the institutions that govern us, then to interpersonal oppression. This is another one of the I's, is the way oppression plays out with each other. And then internalized oppression, which is the way we play violence out against ourselves due to the way we've internalized these ideas from the dominant group. But the point is, if I can teach somebody who they are is something to be ashamed of, if I can teach them that they should dislike people who are unlike them, then I can control them. And all of this is about control. Banning books is about control. Challenging books is about control. Changing the language we're allowed to use when talking about ourselves and our identities, the language that people use to talk about themselves, all of those things are about control. And if it was just about books, then it wouldn't feel so urgent. It wouldn't feel so present. But it's not just about books. This isn't just about stories, and it never has been. This is a fight for so many of our lives, and the battleground on which it is fought is language. Book bans are never going to be about books themselves. They're about the removal of queer people from public life. It's about telling BIPOC folks that they shouldn't talk about oppression, that they shouldn't talk about the things that hurt or harm them. If politicians want queer people, especially queer young people, to be ashamed and so afraid of who they are that they will hide away. But there's no eliminating queer stories, and there's no eliminating queer people. We have been here, and we will always be here. There is no eliminating Black stories. We've been telling these stories since before it was even legal for us to learn to read or write. And so I am doing the work of my ancestors by continuing this tradition of writing stories that I've been told are not supposed to be written, or articulating narratives that are told were not supposed to be articulated. Part of this tradition is bridging gaps between people. And the way that we do that is by telling stories about ourselves, to ourselves, but also to each other. And so Loudmouth, my bookstore, is and always will be the assertion that no matter how hard you try to eliminate us or how hard you try to silence us, we're not going anywhere, because we've always been here and we always will be here. And I'm assuming that a lot of you who are watching this or listening to me or whatever are not writers or artists. And so I hope in some ways that this is helpful. And for some of you who are not, I hope I've said something that you can take with you, something that may be practical that you can put into your work as budding organizers and leaders. The thing that I wish somebody had told me when I was your age is that it is imperative to protect your energy, that you cannot fight on all fronts at all times, and that is okay. It's also imperative that you protect your space, that you build communities around you who can identify with the fights that you're having and stand beside you as you try to fight them. You don't want to have people around you who benefit from your silence or your complacency. And so building your community, finding ways to share these narratives among each other, but also among strangers, is paramount. Publishing a novel is like a really personal thing to do. It's like taking your heart and placing it in somebody else's hands and asking them to hold it with care. And so I've had to power past a lot of anxiety about being perceived in order to sort of do this work, because I feel like it is so important. And I've had to learn how to stand firm in who I am and what I know to be true. And part of that is affirming constantly in my own work that I know what I want and who I am. And part of that in your work as leaders, as I'm sure there's a politician in this room somewhere. I'm sure there's a press secretary in here who's going to start writing the narrative. I'm sure there are journalists in this room. There's somebody in here who's going to start dictating narratives, and you're going to do it very soon. And part of the work that you're going to have to do constantly is affirm to yourself over and over again your own values. deciding what your hard lines are and what you're not willing to deviate from, regardless of what you may come up against. That's really tough. That's tough business. But principles are not principles until they cost you something. So deciding early on what principles and what you're willing to pay for them is going to be crucial in your fight against any sense of injustice. So I'm going to leave you with some reading, okay? One of my favorite writers, her name is Audre Lorde. May she rest in peace. Also, my mother. I have multiple. She wrote what's called a litany for survival, and in that she talks about how she's seeking a now that breeds futures. And in my work, what I'm trying to do is dismantle ideas of who is worthy of good things and who's not by giving good things to my characters. In my classroom, I'm trying to do that work by being present for my students, by reminding them that the space for the work they're interested in doing is there if only they're willing to create it. And in the world, I'm trying to do that by being loudly, raucously joyful in my daily practices of gratitude and love. And so I'd be remiss if I got up here and talked about remaining joyful and standing on your principles and your values if I didn't also acknowledge that right now there is a genocide happening, and it is my responsibility to give light to that issue, to acknowledge that it's not only happening, but also that it is our bare minimum not to turn away from it, to amplify the stories that are coming out of Gaza or Rafah, and acknowledge that these are people who are being harmed in a way that I could not possibly imagine. But also, by acknowledging that, speaking truth to that experience, that is also a way of reallocating power back to people who are having it stolen from them. And so part of the work that we're doing is acknowledging harm when we see it, when we come up against it, but also creating space for us to reckon with that in whatever ways we can. And so sometimes you reckon with it by writing a novel about it, like I have. Sometimes you'll reckon with it by writing papers about it in your classes. Sometimes you'll reckon with it by shooting the shit in a group chat. Whatever it takes, I want you all to show up for yourselves and each other and acknowledge harm when you sense it, when you see it, but also give space for healing and joy even amidst great harm. You all are experiencing things that I could not possibly understand. Like you're, like 19, 20? Like you're toddlers. And I know it does not feel like that, but you are so early on in your journey of becoming whoever it is you're going to become. And so right now, it is important to make whatever practices of gratitude and joy a daily and constant practice. It is not something that you should pick up when you turn 30 the way that I had to. It's something that you should be doing right now, because making space for that joy is radical and it is necessary. And it is the root of how we can reclaim these stories for ourselves. And so I get asked pretty often, like, what's the role of queer YA right now? People look at me like I'm an oracle. And I think there's something about the hair, like there's something that gives like, ooh, she has a lot of secrets in there. I don't. I really don't. But I would encourage anybody who asks the question of like, oh, what is the point of stories right now? I want us to push ourselves past that. What is the work that we're doing? And how are we doing it? And what is being lost when we don't do it are the questions I want us to be asking ourselves. And all that's to say that my work as a Black queer writer is the work of reminding Black children in particular, because I write for kids, that they're worthy of lives without pain and violence. And that work does not stop when I get tired. It does not stop when it snows. It continues constantly. And the only way that I can be energized to keep telling these stories in the face of a world that wants me silent or does not want me to stand up in front of rooms and tell people that I have been harmed and I am undoing that harm actively every day for other people. The only way for me to do that is by continuing to find those pockets of joy and also reckoning, and relying on my community. For me, in my books, race and sexuality and gender and class and place cannot be separated. And so long as both my Blackness and my queerness remains a threat to a lot of people in positions of power, I'll keep putting these stories of Black joy and triumph out into the world. And it's all I know how to do. I didn't have a lot of skills growing up, you know what I mean? Once again, when you learn that you have a talent, you gotta lean into it, okay? So whatever your talent is, wherever you find it, wherever you have found that your voice is the strongest or the loudest, I want you to hold on to that with both hands. And when I found that my gift was writing, I realized that while it is a small contribution to unraveling systems that are likely going to take my entire life to unravel, I realized that there is no more work that is more worthy of doing than that. And so even if it's exhausting, even if it's wearing you down, it is work that must continue. Thank you.